Trek favorites. What are yours? Welcome to Trek Favorites. I'm Chuck Joyner, and this is a show where I get to talk with my Trek friends and my tech friends about their favorite episodes of Star Trek. As you know, we don't do a lot of summaries or background or anything. We just kind of remind you about what the episode's about, and then we go from there. So please feel free to look in the show notes. I'll have a link in Memory Alpha to this week's episode. So if you need extra reminder, you can go there, or just go and watch Star Trek wherever it's available at whenever you're seeing this. This time, Mr. Michael E. Cohen is here to talk about one of his favorite episodes. Michael, it's great to have you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
It's good to be here, and it's really good to be here not talking about a Pages book update.
Yeah, that's the other show, Michael. That's the other show.
Exactly.
Oh, so you picked episode 18, I think it was.
Right.
Season 3 of Deep Space Nine.
The 64th episode.
The 60, okay. And of Deep Space Nine. But you told me that this particular episode had a very special meaning. It's not necessarily one of your favorites, but it has a special meaning to you. And so yeah. I'm not going to steal your thunder. I'm just going to let you explain that.
Well, actually, my relationship with Star Trek goes way back much further than that episode. When I was in junior high school, for a while I lived in Hollywood on a street called Gregory, half a block from Gower and Melrose. And every day when I would get up and go to school, I'd pass by this bland beige wall. And one day there were big posters up on it. It was Desilu Studios. They're in a corner of the Paramount lot, which is where I lived. And one day I saw this poster go for something called Star Trek. So when the original series was being filmed, I was living about, a few hundred yards away. So I've been close to Star Trek for a long time. It was also a great apartment building generally because occasionally actors would live there short-term leases. So my adolescence was encouraged by a neighbor named Julie Newmar, who lived there for a few months.
Julie Newmar, Catwoman from the original Batman series.
Exactly. Catwoman was briefly my neighbor, which really, really helped me with puberty.
I can understand
that. So that was my first brush with Star Trek. I lived like right next door to Star Trek. And then in the late 70s, I went to work at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for a while, getting out of graduate school. And while I was there, they were getting images coming back from the Voyager flybys of Jupiter. And so, I was actually writing software to help test the telemetry systems that handled that stuff coming in. And that was at the same time that there was this film called Star Trek: The Motion Picture, where the successor to Voyager turned out to be the villain, if you will. V'ger. Remember? V'ger 6, Voyager 6?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I remember seeing that film, having worked actually a little bit with Voyager and thinking, that's a hell of a software upgrade.
Hardware and software, actually.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
So there was that, but a year later, I went back to work at UCLA, and I was helping with something called the writing programs, writing instructional software. And one of the people I encountered was this lovely teacher, not a professor. He refused to become a professor. He was instead a senior lecturer in the English department, a guy named David Rhodes. He taught Shakespeare classes, among other things. And I was like the computer helper for the entire English department, among other things. So I got to meet David. David had a good friend, a guy named Patrick Stewart, who would hang out with David from time to time and appear in David's classes, to do Shakespearean readings. And it was during one of those classes that one of the students had his dad come to college with him for a day. His dad was Robert Justman. And they were just ramping up on the creation of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And he saw Patrick Stewart doing his Patrick Stewart thing in front of this class and said, this could be our Picard. And that's how Stewart got asked for the job. Stewart's voice used to be on David Rhodes' answering machine all the time until Star Trek became big and suddenly people were calling his number just to hear his answering machine voice. So he finally had to get rid of that message. But for a while you'd hear, this is 310-393. Oh my God.
Oh.
And in fact, I would occasionally see Patrick Stewart at certain English department dues for people who contributed money. There was a group called the Friends of English. And David would help set up these programs, to entertain these wealthy donors. And Patrick Stewart would come by from time to time to do readings and like that. And so he would show up, he's a charming man whose voice could fill a room like nobody's business. He'd open his mouth and it was just like he had a built-in sound system. It was incredible. Anyway, and he's also not that much taller than me, and I'm only like 5'6", so that was kind of neat. So that was another brush with Star Trek, through David Rhodes and that. At the time, I was also working on something called the UCLA Writing Programs that taught English composition. The guy who ran that, now a retired professor, is a guy named Richard Lanham, who is a world expert on rhetoric and surprisingly on intellectual property, because he's testified as an expert witness in cases on plagiarism and like that. So anyway, Dick and I became friends over the years because I helped write software to help teach English composition. And he moved from a house in Westwood up to a place north of Sunset Boulevard. One of his neighbors at the end of the cul-de-sac on which he lived was a guy named Alex Singer, and he and Dick got to be good friends. They would hang out from time to time. Eventually, Alex had some computer problems, and since I was one of Dick's helpers, I became one of Alex's helpers too. And so I got to hang out with Alex Singer, who turned out to be a charming man, and we would just hang out for fun sometimes. He was just a great guy. And one day I get a phone call from Dick saying that Alex has invited me and my wife to the set of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, something called Star Trek Deep Space Nine. He didn't know anything about it. Dick knows nothing about science fiction. He said, would you like to come along? Because he knew that I was into that sort of thing. So I went, and that's how I found myself one day in somewhere in the 90s on the Paramount lot on a soundstage watching a couple of scenes of Star Trek: The Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine get shot. And it was the episode Distant Mirrors with Alexander Siddig as Dr. Bashir, lost on the promenade deck, among other places, or lost inside of his own head. And I got to watch those scenes being filmed, so I got to see what it's like to shoot an episode of Star Trek, or at least a part of it. I later found out that Alex had done a number of episodes of Star Trek, including the famous one with Scotty being found after all those years trapped in a transporter beam. I think it was called Relics. Do you remember that one?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, Alex directed that as well. So that was my big brush with Star Trek. Finally, to be on the set, on the promenade, in ops, in Deep Space Nine.
So there's so many things here that. I mean, and unfortunately, there some of them are about the episode, but. The set. I mean, the set always looks, gives you the impression that it's massive. And of course, I'm never sure if that's television magic or if it was real.
Surprisingly, it's not an entire space station.
Well, no, thank you. I knew that.
But it was actually two sound stages with the promenade taking up most of one of them. And it was a two-story thing with, levels you could walk on and look down and look up. As I was wandering around, there was a little eating area, part on the promenade. And if you looked up, there were actually menus with choices on them with really ridiculous, funny titles like, Mama Goch's, famous Klingon recipes, sort of thing. Seriously, in jokes for the staff and crew, but it looked really real on camera because you couldn't actually read the text.
Right.
But I got to hang out and have lunch on the promenade.
Well, now I'm sure it's probably too much to ask you to remember what scenes were being shot. That would be crazy.
Actually, I can because it was near the beginning of the episode, and they didn't use a lot of what Alex shot that day. Just to fill you in briefly, here's what the plot of the episode was before the titles, and then just after it. Dr. Bashir's having lunch with his famous Cardassian friend, lamenting over the fact that he's about to turn 30 and it's the end of all things or whatever. And then this guy comes up, Quark brings this guy up, a really ugly looking guy, a Lethian, who wants to get something called biomimetic gel. Bashir tells him, you can't, it's illegal, you can't get that stuff. And then she goes to his, infirmary, which is really just a little nook, half of a set on the actual soundstage, where the Lethian encounters him. He's rummaging through Bashir's stuff to steal the biomimetic gel, grabs Bashir by the head, lightning bolts come out of his fingertips, Bashir passes out, cut to main titles. When you come back from main titles, Bashir wakes up, the lights are all funky, the station seems completely deserted, and he goes wandering around looking for what's going on while he hears vaguely voices in the distance. So the scene I saw shot was Bashir waking up and beginning his walk through the station looking for the voices and trying to find out what's going on.
And at that particular point in the story,
we don't know what the hell's going on.
Well, yeah, first of all, you don't know what's going on, but Siddig also was not heavily made up at that point, other than normal
Right, there was
makeup.
just a little bit of gray on his temples.
Right.
In the course of the episode, he gets older and older until he's like, wearing this incredible latex mask of, age and barely able to walk, and the episode's resolved. I didn't see those things get shot. I just got to see the opening scenes where he's beginning to look. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And it's not a really dramatic scene, and so what Alex wanted to do is to make it visually interesting. Let me tell you a little bit about Alex. He's a guy from New York who grew up with a best friend whose name was Stanley Kubrick. They were best buddies, and they would hang out learning to shoot and photograph things together. So as kids, they were, amateur photographers, and Kubrick became a big photographer and director, and Alex got into the same business, but he's always really been interested in cameras and camera shots and angles and how things look. And he had a real love of science fiction. So when he got a chance to work on Star Trek, it was like, oh, yes, of course. At that time, he directed a lot of TV. He'd done Cagney and Lacey. He directed The Monkees. He'd done a whole bunch of stuff on TV, done a few films as well. Was a photographer on one of Kubrick's early film, I think called Fatal Kiss or something like that. So he'd been around for a while, but so he wanted to make it visually interesting. So what he wanted for this scene is to have basically a long tracking shot of Bashir prowling the station. And rather than put the camera on a dolly and move it around, he got Jonathan West to don this big harness with a Steadicam on it, which was an enormously heavy thing. But then Jonathan West was a kind of a big guy, the director of photography, so he could handle it. But the idea was to do this whole marching through the station thing, or wandering through the station, in a single take, which meant they were going from one set into another set, which were kind of put together so it looked like it was going through the station, whereas in fact, these things were really not that close together at the station, were a real thing. And so that was what they did, and it was like, 4 or 5 different run-throughs to get the timing down just right. And that's basically what I saw being shot, with Alexander Siddig, trying to look shocked and bewildered on take after take after take and know which way to turn and like that to keep the camera going.
Michael, when you see something like that, when you see behind the scenes and you see something being shot, it obviously affects then how you view the finished product.
Oh yeah.
Maybe it's a little bit, maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's easier, maybe it's harder to suspend disbelief and kind of buy into the story. How did that affect your viewing of this after you saw the finished product?
Not so much as you think, but here's a reason for that. As an undergraduate at UCLA, my undergraduate degree was in motion picture television production. So I kind of knew about Hollywood magic and how things worked on the set. And after that sort of, education, I couldn't go to any movie without, one part of me going, I wonder how they storyboarded that. How many setups did they do? Did they have to do a lot of takes? What kind of coverage did they have on that scene? So those questions are always a little bit in the back of my head. So for me, it was fun to see the details of how Alex directed a scene and how he dealt with actors and how he dealt with crew and how he dealt with the inevitable technical problems. Like you've got these monitors on Deep Space Nine, where you get all the computer readouts and they're all glitchy in this episode because the station's deserted and things are all wrong and the computer's gone bad. But they had to do special video to run through these monitors, which were actually on the set, to look like glitchy video, and they couldn't get it to run at first, and so they have these blank screens, and that wasn't quite right. And time is money when you're doing a shoot, so you could feel tempers getting a little hot, and Alex trying to keep people cool as the problems were resolved. So you see that sort of thing as well, and that's fun.
Yeah, and back then they couldn't composite things in like they can now. So
not as easily. I mean, the special effect of Bashir's head exploding with lightning in the opening scene, of course, is animated after the fact. But that was an expensive optical process before you really did CGI.
Yeah.
The first science fiction series that really made good use of CGI was on at the same time, and it was about a space station. It was called Babylon 5.
I'm absolutely a huge Babylon 5 fan.
Yeah, that's a fantastic thing in its own right.
Well, and I promise folks, we're not going to go off on a Babylon 5 rant here, but Babylon 5 just had a whole different angle. I mean, as much as people talk about the story arc production of today's television, mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's exactly where it started, but that was definitely one where
it was an early case. And the fact was that J. Michael Straczynski wrote most of the episodes. So for him, it was like, a video novel stretched over 5 seasons,
right?
With a beginning, a middle, and end,
Well, and
not much like that had been done at that time on American television.
No, and what was fascinating about it, as you watched it, is that an episode, one line in an episode in the first season might have significant implications in like the third season.
Oh yeah,
and it was so well done, and it was different than Star Trek. So I was kind of bummed when I remember when it first came out, thinking, okay, Trek is doing a space station now. Some other joker is going to do a space station series too. And the two couldn't have been more different, and I love them both.
Exactly. What Babylon 5 had going for it was a complete story arc and building a universe in which that story lived. Star Trek had a pre-existing universe that it was telling various stories about. So it is a different narrative dynamic, that most Star Trek episodes were standalone, very few linked together.
Until later.
But you had these recurring characters you became really familiar with.
Right.
One of the fun things that I learned about special effects on that day on the set, when you're on Deep Space Nine and they're in some conference room or something, you see a star field out a portal window and the stars just kind of slowly drifting by. You know how that effect is produced? 2 big burly stagehands hauling a huge scrim with a star field on it very slowly past the opening of the window. So it looks like the stars are moving. It's just a big painted piece of cloth that's black with little white dots on it.
Well, hey, I mean, again, first of all, if it's well done, you buy it. But in the second place, back in those days, I mean, that's what you had to work with.
Well, also, it's really much cheaper than CGI. You're gonna have the stagehands there anyway. You don't have to pay a post house, to composite it in. And then, there are guys hanging around like there's, touch-up painters. They're there because the sets, which look like this incredible metal architecture, it's all cheap wood, and carved plastic and like that's painted. And it gets easily scuffed and scratched as people move through the set. A camera hits a wall, things get dinged, and so they got to touch it up and make it look good. Plus, these parts all move around. There are various corridors in Deep Space Nine that are different corridors on different episodes. They move them around relative to each other. They dress them a little different. This one set could be 4 or 5 different locations, depending on the episode, the needs of the story.
Yeah, that's something that's always fascinated me. Because that's why I was asking you about the size of the of the set, because I know just changing camera angles and redressing things a little bit can make it. Sometimes it just looks redressed, but so much of the time it just looks. Yeah, you buy it. It's in the scope of the story that it's 3 corridors down and to the left than the last corridor you were in.
Exactly.
So. Yeah.
So anyway, that was my day on the set, which was ever so much fun.
I would think so. So. And this, I mean, I would agree with the assessment you sent me an email. This may not have been one of the best Star Trek DS9 episodes, but it still is. I think it's interesting. I mean, and it really does showcase Siddig's capabilities as an actor.
Oh yeah,
because he really does play the aging thing so well, so that I mean, okay, again, the makeup in those days was not as good as it is now, but yeah, you can suspend disbelief pretty easily and see him aging and recognize that, yeah, this is the way it really happens to all of us.
Also, in terms of story arcs generally for a series, this episode was meant not to advance any storyline about Deep Space Nine, but to give you the backstory about Dr. Bashir. And in the course of this episode, we find out a whole lot about him, what his youth was like, that he was a tennis player, that he didn't quite become number 1 in his medical school class because he deliberately made a mistake on an exam. You find out a lot of backstory about him that you didn't know before, which would pay off in later episodes. The relationships he has with other people on the station.
And so you make a great point, because so often those kind of episodes about any character in any series, Trek or not, oftentimes are kind of like, they feel like a filler episode until you realize that, okay, I'm learning about this character, something I will need to know later that will make a huge difference.
It also gave a chance for the other actors to have more time off, because although you've got Odo, you got Kira, you got O'Brien, they're all in this episode, but relatively small parts. It's mostly focusing on Bashir, which means they don't have to be on set every day that the episode's being shot. None of them were around the day I was there with Alex, because it was only Bashir on the deserted station. That was the stuff they were shooting that day. So the other cast got a day off. And when you're shooting an episodic series, week after week after week, you've got to turn out like 22 of those things, in the course of 9 months. It can be exhausting.
Oh yeah, we've all heard the stories of wrapping at 3 a.m. and needing to be back at 7 a.m. the next morning.
Especially if you're like a Klingon, and it takes like an hour and a half to put on your makeup, or if you're Renee Auberjonois, and you've got to put on your clone makeup, send in the clones.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean,
Shapeshifter. Right?
Yeah, I really admire the actors who do that. I mean, well, think about Quark. With what that actor had to go through, the makeup he had to go through.
Yeah.
Every single time he made an appearance, he had to go on that. I know that they used to talk about Nimoy and how long he would sit in the chair, and that was nothing compared to some of these other people. There you go.
Yeah, these things are not easy to put on to make look good on camera in a close-up.
Yeah, but they're not like the big head, Ferengi head either. So, and well, we can go on down, every Trek series that was just
the original Trek Klingons didn't look much like the Klingons we know because they didn't have time to put that sort of makeup on and didn't have the money back then.
Oh yeah. Now
they look, by the next generation they began to look like aliens.
Yeah, and by the time they hit Discovery, I mean, they really, they clearly are alien. So, you mentioned that this didn't advance the DS9 story; it advanced more Bashir's story.
Right.
Were you overall a DS9 fan, or are you just like me, a Star Trek fan? Period.
Well, yes and yes. I was a Star Trek fan generally. I mean, as slow and turgid as Star Trek: The Motionless Picture was, in 1979, I loved it anyway. Because it was Star Trek and it was on the big screen and it had good special effects. And it brought the band back together. It was all the stuff I wanted in a Star Trek movie, even though, Robert Wise directed the slowest Star Trek episode ever.
Yeah, and I remember feeling that way when I first saw it, but now I go back and watch it, and the pacing is definitely slower, but I can absolutely enjoy it. Mm-hmm. And I guess that just is a testament to how much of a Star Trek fan I am. But I didn't.
Also, let's face it, even as slow as the film was, it still looked good. It was well acted. Wise, was not a piker as a director. He did some pretty big films like Sound of Music. So,
yeah, but again, and that's another thing that sometime I hope to learn more about is how producers go from doing something like, say, The Sound of Music to something that is so different like Star Trek. I guess, maybe directing is just directing, and I don't fully appreciate it, but
episodic television directing is different than film directing, certainly in a large sense. When you're directing a film, the director can often have much more influence on how the thing is put together. Whereas on a show, it's the showrunners that run the things, and directors are brought in to do an episode. And they have so many constraints upon them because there's a whole backstory, there's stuff going ahead. They can't do anything really radical that violates the way characters are or the way stories go, because it's got to fit into a continuing narrative over the course of many episodes. Yeah. So, but still, there's a huge amount to do when you're directing a television episode that's takes a week to shoot and cut and get ready. There's several weeks of prep that a director does before he or she ever sets foot on the set. You break down the script, you figure out what gets shot when, what things will cost, where you're going to put the cameras, what people you'll need on what days, and on and on and on. And you have to look at that script and think, how am I going to portray this? Is there a way to do the scene differently that works a lot better? And so they're going to be doing that as well, even though they're under the constraints of what the showrunners and the show writers and the actors who are more invested in the characters and even the director by the third season of a series certainly will be. Even with all of that, the director's got some say in that.
And I would think that that's got to be especially difficult. And I don't know how a director thinks. If he looks at a script and thinks, okay, this is all right, this is mediocre, or boy, this is dynamite, or whatever. Because I'm sure that there are episodes that the director thought, this is okay, and they became fan favorites because of the performances or the effects or, whatever.
I
So,
suspect on this particular episode, Alex looked at that script and said, it's, third-rate Freudian analysis, and it's pretty transparent. It's not a very dramatic episode in a lot of ways. It's a lot of dialogue. I want to figure out a way to make this visually interesting. And so that's why he did that whole Steadicam thing, scene in the opening, to create a sense of foreboding and bizarreness. Because ordinarily you don't track characters walking along through the station. Cut to a close-up, medium shot, close-up, medium shot as they're talking. Or you'll have the camera fixed as they go running down a corridor. But you don't just see people walking along and have the camera follow them through various different rooms. So you're seeing the station differently there. There's later in the episode, when Bashir's hallucinations get really strange, there's birthday cake and birthday balloons, in ops, and it looks like a party that you've never seen before. And I think Alex probably had a whole lot of fun, figuring out how he wanted that set dressed and where he wanted the camera to be so he could get the balloons in the shot just right behind Bashir as he's aging and looking terrible. And meanwhile, you got this party going on behind him. I think that a lot of that was in Alex's head, how can I make this interesting than otherwise relatively pedestrian script?
that's a really interesting point, and I think he succeeds in that regard. I mean, you pretty early on, I believe that you realize that this is probably inside Bashir's head, that you're not seeing the reality of the station.
Right.
But at the same time, that doesn't make it any less eerie. I mean, it's kind of like going to the movies and watching a horror film. You know you're being manipulated. That's what you're there for, and it's obvious that you're not going to have the Rockettes suddenly bursting out of a side door dancing.
Although if he did, wouldn't that be interesting?
Well, it would be very weird, I grant you. But he definitely sets the tone with the lighting and with the mood and almost with the pace as you get into it. That it's not supposed to be lots of action. It's supposed to be a little more, gee, what's around the next corner? It's
a little bit more, dare I say it, cerebral.
Yes. Yes, it is. And it
literally, and yes.
Yeah, it wouldn't have. I mean, if it had been anything less than that kind of cerebral, it absolutely would not have worked.
My feeling is that the script should have really gone through at least another draft. But again, you're episode 18 of a 22 episode season, and you're leading up to the big finale, which all Star Trek episodes would lead up to big season-ending finales. So you'd have to have a few. Not filler episodes, but backstory episodes, stories that aren't essential to the overall season plot.
Right.
And that's where this episode fits in. Instead, we get a good chance to learn about who Bashir is.
So let's see. You had a brush with the original series. You had a brush with The Next Generation. You had a brush with DS9.
Right.
Any brushes with any of the other series?
Not that I know of, but, it's really hard to say. I live in Santa Monica, California, where a lot of people in the business live. And, who knows? I have had a brush with Cole Meany.
Okay.
Transporter Chief O'Brien, Engineer O'Brien.
Sure.
Not that we've ever spoken, but there's an Irish bar restaurant near me, that I sometimes go because they serve a great Irish breakfast. And occasionally when he was in town, he would show up there. So I would see him, at the bar. Irish breakfast, by the way, is not just for breakfast. You can have it for dinner, which is what I was doing at the time. But so, I've seen Cole Meany on the street. And to leave Star Trek aside, I've also been involved with NCIS in that, David McCallum, Ducky on NCIS, occasionally would shop at the 3rd Street Farmers Market that happens every Wednesday morning, the open air farmers market. So, you see people from time to time,
Yeah.
I worked at UCLA where for many years, and that's a huge movie set. It's been in so many movies, I can't even begin to tell you. It's a fun game to say, oh, is that college in that movie really UCLA?
McCallum was Ilya Kuryakin in The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Yes, and there's a Man from U.N.C.L.E. Star Trek connection as well. You know about that one, right?
You can say it, but I am familiar with it.
Before Star Trek ever was shot, William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy appeared together in an episode of Man from U.N.C.L.E., where Shatner is sort of like this popular athlete, young college athlete sort, and Nimoy is a Russian agent, and they run across each other. So they got to act together before they were ever in Star Trek.
It all ties together. And back then, I guess maybe the actor population was smaller, because it seems like if you go back into the 60s and even the early 70s, there are those character actors that maybe never succeeded in getting a really big role, but it just seemed like you remember seeing them on half a dozen different shows, if not more.
Oh, yeah. Well, I went to high school with a lovely young woman whose father was Lyle Talbot, who was a famous, not so famous, but well-regarded character actor in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. My aunt used to play tennis with a guy named Billy Gray, who was Bud on Father's Knows Best. I had a neighbor who once went out on a date with Bill Bixby. And all the kids in the neighborhood came out to look, oh, it's Bill Bixby, as he comes to pick her up, so that was a big deal. So, when you live in this part of the world, things happen. Because I worked at UCLA, I would sometimes get to work early, around 7 in the morning, because I like to leave early and avoid traffic. And one day, I would see this guy walking along campus holding something and reading it. And it was a guy who was on Third Rock from the Sun. Remember that series?
Sure. Yeah.
Running his lines. And we would see each other once or twice a week after that. We never actually spoke, but, kind of nod. Yeah, I see you. You see me. Occasionally, Jane Curtin would go walking with him. They'd run their lines together.
I guess, we're all victims of it. That theirs is a job that is very public facing. Mm-hmm. And if they just happen to get lucky enough, they become very, very well known or bigger than very, very well known. And, the rest of us, they're just doing a job just like the rest of us are doing.
That's right.
But because their job is so public, then people, we all attribute different characteristics to them or different thoughts. And, oh my God, I remember seeing him on TV. Yeah, well, I remember seeing the guy at McDonald's last week, flipping burgers, and, same thing, you tip your hat to him or whatever. And, but you don't think about that. So,
well, because it happens from time to time where I live, my policy has generally been, if I see a celebrity, I'm not going to get in their face, and I don't need their autograph. I want them to have a life. I know I'd want to have a life, if everybody knew my name and knew my face, I want to be kind of left alone sometimes.
Yeah, I'm like you, and I see people go up and they want to get selfies with them, and they want to say, "Gee, I met." Mm-hmm. Well, okay, you met them, but they didn't meet you because they don't remember you, And so at some point, anytime I've run into anyone like that, the only thing if the opportunity presents itself, and I don't mean that I go up and create it, but I'd say, hey, I'm really appreciate your work on this, or really like what you did, or big fan, or something like that, and let it go. But the rest, so. Michael, thank you. This has been really interesting. I had no idea that, I knew what you told me about being on the set with DS9. I had no idea there were all these other connections.
There are even more I could tell you about with show business generally, but we'll do it after the show's over.
All right. That sounds
Silly
good.
Things.
That sounds good. If folks want to quiz you on your Hollywood knowledge or your Hollywood experiences, what's the best place for them to find you?
Well, you can always find me if you look at the Tidbits newsletter online. There's a link that sends email to me, mcohen@tidbits.com. That mail will come to me, certainly. I have several other email addresses, but that one works.
Okay. And any social media connections that you would be willing to share?
At my time in life, not really. You know, I try to keep a low profile and just use things like Facebook and Twitter to be silly. But if you want to see me on Twitter, I'm Lymond on Twitter, Lymond.
Great. So yeah, he's not quite in witness protection, but it's close, folks.
When you have a name like Michael Cohen, who's been in the news all year long, you especially want to keep a low profile.
I can understand that. I can understand that. Well, hey, thank you so much for being here and sharing. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. This was a lot of fun.
It was. It was. Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Trek Favorites. Visit us at trekfavorites.com to see all the folks we've talked to. We have a Facebook page, so you're welcome to leave your comments there. If you have comments about Michael, I'll try to direct them to him. And let us know what you think of this particular pick or any episode of Star Trek. We're always interested in what you are thinking. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for joining us. Visit TrekFavorites.com to access all our shows, watch the video versions on our YouTube channel, and connect with us on Twitter and Facebook as @TrekFavorites.